So, hi, Gregg Perry, the historic preservationist. Today's episode for New Jersey's oldest colonial tavern, the Sign of the Key Tavern in historic Woodstown, is butter. And right now I'm holding a butter churn here, which is somewhat falling apart. But I want to show you the inside. You can see that it's put together with what they call staves. Um, and if you're not keeping this hydrated with making a butter, this is what occurs. You're going to start getting cracks randomly, and then the bloody thing is going to leak. But once the butter is made, once it's churned, the butter will fall to the bottom, and then the liquid will be on top of that, the buttermilk, and then you're just going to pour it out. Okay? And this is the plunger, the mixer, and I think it's falling apart here a little bit. But this goes in here, and you would have some able-bodied people that are going to really hold this down, and they're going to plunge, 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 sometimes 60, 100 times per minute for about 2 hours to fill this up. And you're going to get out of this probably around 20 pounds of butter in this. So kind of considerable. But then somebody came, and a woman I knew many years ago, about 35 years ago, she was a decorative painter. This was falling apart. I glued it back together for her, and she painted it for me. So nice little scene here. And I must add, when we got later into the 18th century, they took barrels and they did rotary churns. So imagine this was a barrel. They turned it on the side and put it between centers, and it would turn. And they'd have a foot power. They'd pedal it just like you would pedal an old sewing machine. And this guy would turn very fast. They could do an excess of 40 to 70 pounds of butter, depending on the barrel size. So let's get into it. Hi, Gregg Perry, the historic preservationist. Welcome to the next episode of Sign of the Key Tavern, New Jersey's oldest colonial tavern, located in historic Woodstown, New Jersey. So today's episode, I'm going to it should be a quick one. I'm just going to talk a little bit about foodstuffs. In 1669, when the tavern initially opened, and again, this is what you're going to see as our thumbnail. So we'll make sure everybody knows that America's 250th anniversary. So my contribution to that, we're talking about colonial taverns, specifically the Sign of the Key, or maybe a few other ones, or information relating to taverns. That's our genre until probably July 4th or August. But today, when that tavern opened in 1669, our last episode was talking about the amount of timber. They cleared just enough timber to put the tavern in. And it took another 2 years basically to clear probably 190 to 250 feet around the house, around the tavern, rather, around the dwelling, to clear that out for a horse stable, um, a whipping post, and for land for a vegetable garden, and for in the future would have been for pigs, chickens, cows, and things of that nature. So it took another 2 years before that was available. So otherwise, they would have been bartering with people that were already living here, and living in anybody living before this tavern in 1669 would have been living in log cabins, essentially, kind of Quonset hut type log cabins, one room log cabins, or they were bartering with the Native Americans also. Um, so probably on the opening day of the tavern, and that was in March of 1669, um, you would have had a porridge, an ale, or a hard cider, and that was all you could have gotten. You could have had that porridge for dinner, for lunch, whenever it was. And they only had 3 people in that tavern that day. So that just shows you it was a slow go because, again, solid forest. Anybody almost had to come through the royal port of Salem and start making the journey up to Old Burlington. And that was all part of King's Highway in front of the tavern at that point. But anyway, so taking 2 years to clear out the and get some land to grow some vegetables and things. And let's face it, you only do that in the warm months. So then you have to compensate, or you have to have they also had a root cellar, as they called it, in the back, and they stored carrots and potatoes and different things like that. So those things were stored there for use in the wintertime. And I believe not, and for another probably 30 years, they actually created an ice house behind the tavern, the Colonial Tavern. So By the second year, they actually added, you could have rabbit, you could have venison, and you could have pork, but not all at once. You would have one or the other. So you had one meat, organic entree, and that was it. There wasn't any sides. That was it. You had a piece of pork to chew on. You had a leg to chew on, or you had something, a piece of chicken, um, piece of fowl. So I've been asked, well, how did they season their food? Well, this was a slow process going from 1669, and probably not in 1675 were they actually growing things out there, and they had a more diverse menu, which was pretty stark at best, even when it was diverse. Uh, they added butter. So we're going to talk a little bit about butter. So this episode today is butter. So it's been thought by a lot of people, colonial minds, that butter was only for the affluent, the rich. No, it wasn't. Butter was all around. The Indians were making a type of butter. Um, there was barter with an applesauce also from the Indians, butter. But the colonials here at the tavern in year two started doing their own butter. They had a butter churn, and all you have to do is take heavy whipping cream, and you have to churn it in a churn. And a churn was probably around an average churn about 2 feet high, and you'd get about eight gallons in there, possibly 2.5 feet high, about 8 gallons, and you would end up actually with about 56 pounds of butter in that 8 gallons, and that's a lot of butter, and how long does that last? But so you'd be churning it, and the churning is a pumping action, and you would have had Native Americans would have been doing that bartering, or you little later you may have had some slaves doing it. Uh, if you had some children that in the tavern, uh, but you have Samuel Shivers going in 1770, 1676. Samuel Shivers would have been there, so he possibly could have been churning the butter. So when churning, you have to churn very quickly. So you're almost churning one up and down stroke per second. Churn, 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 churn like this. And, at least 60 per second. Some people that were really doing it fast could get about 100 per minute. So 100 churns per minute, 60 churns per minute. That's what it took to beat and segregate. So the butter would end this glob at the bottom. So you started with heavy whipping cream. You ended up with over here with buttermilk and butter fat. Butter fat was butter. That's what it was. And you would take the butter churn, you'd pull the activator up, the plunge up, turn the whole churn over, drain the buttermilk on the ground, or you put it in a container. Some people may want to use it for cooking. Some people may want to drink it, depending on how long it's been sitting. But we were after the butter. Um, so the butter, all you want to do at that point, but you still would have a little bit of milk in there. So you'd lift the butter out, put it on in a big bowl, and you would kind of sieve it out. The bowl would have a sieved or holy portion in the bottom, and you would get a paddle and you start pushing on the mound of butter in this huge bowl, and you like squeeze it out, and it would be dripping down into a larger bowl, say on the floor or on your lap. So that's what you tried to do. What would also help later on in the late 1670s and on, if you had some ice. So it's in the winter. If you had some ice from the ice house, you put it around this mound of butter in a bowl, and what it would do, it would help to evacuate more of the moisture out of the butter. And all you had to do with the butter for flavoring was put a little salt in there. And this would embark into any type of meat you were cooking, any vegetable. Butter was used on everything. And, it imparted this greasy, oily texture in the meat, and it tended to draw the flavor out. And when it draw the flavors out, it, with the flavor of the butter, ends up on your palate, and that aids and abets of the tasting, your tasting process or our tasting process. So the salt did that, and also the salt, if you put enough in, you would preserve this mound of butter. Just imagine you're in July at the oldest tavern in New Jersey, and you have this mound of butter, and it was stored in firkins. A firkin was about this big, and it's a little wooden container, almost looks like a part of a butter churn without the top. It has a little wooden lid on it, so it could be stored in there for several weeks with enough salt. Also, if you took this slab of butter, or this dollop of butter, maybe we'll call it, put it in a big cast iron pot, put it over the old fireplace, the 11-foot fireplace in the Shivers House Museum, put it in there and heat it up and pasteurize it. So you would be very sure that you were going to have longevity out of your butter if you pasteurized it and you put enough salt in it. It may be a bit too salty for some people, but I think as opposed to getting sick, it was a better deal. Um, so anyway, so that's it for today. That's talking about the butter. Was that seasoning, and also, I mean, a lot of times you would walk in there and they were cooking bread in the hearth fireplace. That was the meal. There was no venison, there was no rabbit, there was no pork, there was no porridge. They were cooking bread today, bread and butter. Great meal. And I can attest to that because when I was in France for 5 years, that was the perfect lunch. A huge baguette with some handmade French butter. You can go and buy about 4 or 5 ounces in the supermarket there for a couple dollars, a couple euros, and off you go. That's a meal to me. A little bit of cheese on that would be nice, but so anyway, we won't get too picky. But thanks everyone for viewing, and don't forget to listen to my podcast, The Historic Preservationist. We're nearing 1,000 different episodes. Gregg Perry, thanks all for listening.